This is not an unsolvable problem. We know what could work. We just don't do it. In some things, if you have ALS, only a scientific breakthrough is going to change your prognosis. If you have schizophrenia, I would say the vast majority of people who have the illness could be doing better than they are simply because of the limitation of the treatment they've received.
Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman has treated thousands of patients with mental disorders, many of whom have schizophrenia, over his 40-year career as a physician and scientist. He is the author of a new book, Malady of the Mind, Schizophrenia and the Path to Prevention, and he has lots to say to the three moms and to all of us. In the book is a clear, compelling exposition of how schizophrenia can and should be successfully treated. And you'll hear all about it in this episode. Welcome to our podcast, Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches. From the place where schizophrenia and real life collide. East Coast, West Coast, Middle America. With Miriam Feldman, Mindy Greiling, and Randy Kay. We are currently at episode 69, and I have been trying to get Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman on the show for the longest time, and I'm so excited he is here with us today. Jeff is the author of this book called Malady of the Mind, subtitle, very important to listeners of this podcast, Schizophrenia and the Path to Prevention. And wouldn't that be nice? We would love, love, love prevention, but there's so much in this book. We're going to dive almost right into it. Just want to mention two things. And if you're watching on YouTube, Jeff is, can we call you Jeff or do we call you Dr. Lieberman? What's the official?
Please call me Jeff or Jeffrey, whatever you want. And talking to me, Dr. Lieberman, makes me feel old.
Okay. All right. Perfect. So I bet you liked it when you were 21 though, or 24 and you first got that MD, true. Right? So don't turn your camera off, Jeff, just stay with us. But I want to mention that our last two episodes, 67 and 68, were about the angry moms in Washington and clozapine and the REMS. And one of them was our guest, Sue Maida. And then the last episode, we had permission from the Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance. Did I get that right? To actually be the first people to release the video of the testimony in Washington. So our last episode 68, only had me introducing it at the beginning, and it was like, take it away, people with psychosis and their families. So Mindy wants to share something that happened as a result of those last two episodes.
Right. Thank you, Randy. Well, not very happy news, but since I'm the public policy director for Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance, I got an email today from a woman who had watched our podcast, and therefore she knew to contact SNPAA. And she said she had contacted over 100 Congress people about the REMS. She was really on a tear because it was harming her daughter. And actually, after she finished her contacts with Congress, her daughter died by suicide. So this is a serious issue, and I'm glad we dedicated two programs to it. And maybe Dr. Lieberman, Jeffrey, I guess we're going to call him, will have a comment about that as well.
Yeah,
I
we
hope
can
so.
definitely. And REMS are, for those who didn't hear the last two episodes, REMS are
risk evaluation mitigation strategies. So it's something that the Federal Drug Administration requires, and it's overkill. It's necessary when you're phasing into clozapine, but after that, it's a barrier. Clearly, it was a barrier for this young woman.
Did REMS was the reason? Did she ultimately not start clozapine because of the barrier of REMS?
It was an email, so I didn't get a chance to talk to the mother, but that's what she said, but she didn't give any details.
Well, there's a couple of aspects to the underutilization of clozapine and the difficulty in accessing it. First, among the class of antipsychotic medications, you can generalize by saying that most of the differences between them are in the domain of side effects as opposed to efficacy. The exception, though, is clozapine. It clearly is a superior medication in terms of efficacy for pharmacologic reasons that still have not been precisely determined. But the thing is that it's vastly underutilized. The market share of people who have schizophrenia or have treatment-resistant schizophrenia, however it's defined, that are receiving it, is a fraction of the number that would be eligible and potentially benefit from it. Now, REMS is certainly one factor, and REMS is really a pretty cynical device because it's ostensibly to protect. You put guardrails around patients receiving it because it has serious, even potentially lethal side effects, but it's really a medical legal thing to protect the pharmaceutical company and the doctors. But it discourages people from using it. But even if there weren't REMS, or REMS were relaxed to be much less stringent, I would wonder whether the utilization would increase to what it should be. And I don't want to demean my colleagues, but there's just an avoidance to using it, either because of perceived risk, because of the hassle of REMS, or because of just the desire, not to do what's necessary to manage people on clozapine, which does require more oversight and intervention. But it's just there's no excuse for it. Absolutely no excuse for it.
I think we're definitely all on the same page, and you devote quite a lot of time in your book. We have read your book and we have questions, but I just want to say I feel like I should get a medical degree after reading this book. There's a lot to it. There's, along with your stories of your many, many years as a psychiatrist, Patrick Kennedy, former U.S. Congressman and founder of the Kennedy Forum, says Dr. Lieberman tackles one of the most complex and misunderstood mental health conditions. I think we can agree with that, with precision, compassion, and grace, grounded in historical context and Lieberman's own rich clinical expertise. The book offers readers a meaningful understanding of the past, the present, and the promising future of schizophrenia treatment. And boy, could we use promising future. So I will say that there is a lot about the history that I wasn't aware of. Most of my education came from the schizophrenia, E. Fuller Torrey's book, is the manual basically about schizophrenia. But there was so much about how much you clearly care about your patients, and a section about what you call the scientific circus, all the different theories and misunderstandings, and then how schizophrenia is diagnosed. And of course, our favorite part, the path to prevention. How do you diagnose it? What would be the best way? How important is early intervention? Schizophrenia and society, do the right thing. And you also talk about the importance of having someone to care about you, the importance of family. So there's so much in this book. I highly recommend it. It's not a simple read. It took me about 10 days because I had to absorb and wait. But if you want to feel really well informed about schizophrenia and hear some great stories, we all do highly recommend it. So knowing that we have about 45 minutes to an hour to talk, before we get into specifics, Jeff, can you just say, are there 2 to 3 main points that you hope people will take away from your book?
Yeah. Well, first, let me say that I had never written a book for anything for the lay public. I was a pointy-headed scientist who wrote hundreds of scientific papers. But in 2015, I felt compelled to, because of the lack of understanding about mental illness and psychiatry, I felt compelled to try and dispel the mystery and the confusion. And I started with, psychiatry. And my publisher gave it somewhat unflattering title of Shrinks, The Untold Story of Psychiatry. And when I had a much more poetic title, and when I said Shrinks, that's kind of demeaning. It's like pimple poppers for dermatologists or gas passers for anesthesiologists. That's what people think. So, but that was less dense than Malady of the Mind. And I wrote Malady of the Mind you have to write a book that's accessible and engages the reader, even the reader that has no experience with mental illness or medicine or science. And that means putting stories, anecdotes, etc. But to do justice to the illness, I felt that you had to go into the science, the good, the bad, and the ugly over history in order to lay out how the trajectory of our coming to terms with understanding and treating the illness occurred. And, it may not be a book you read from front to back, but I think it's worth plowing through and getting, because right now I think it encompasses exactly where we are. But in terms of what are the takeaway messages, I would say three things, and they're very simple. First, schizophrenia is a brain disorder, okay? It's not a disorder. The brain is a unique organ. It's one of many organs, the kidney, the lungs, the heart, the liver, but it is the only organ that has a metastructure. A metastructure meaning the mind or the psyche, and if you're so inclined, the spirit. And so it's unique, and these are the result of what are a principle called emergent properties. When you have a structure that is so complex and is of such a large scale, things that are not predicted by the elemental parts, the cells, the connections, can emerge. And that's what happened in evolution in human beings. And so the brain is truly unique. So it's a brain disorder. It's not a disorder of traumatic experience, of the way that you were, your environment growing up. Psychological contributions to mental illnesses are real and numerous and serious, but make no mistake, this occurs at a biological level. Second thing is that it's not a one-time deal. And because most people don't know what it is in advance, when it strikes their child or their adolescent, they're kind of dumbstruck, and they think, oh, it's a one and done thing. It's not a one and done thing. It's not like breaking your leg and recovering. It's not like having the flu. It's not even like having cancer and having it successfully surgically excised. It's a potentially recurrent and chronic and disabling disorder. And then the third thing, which is I think the most important, is that it's not just treatable, it's potentially preventable. Now, there's three kinds of prevention. The best kind is prevent something from happening altogether, preventing the illness from having an onset. But there's secondary prevention, which means, okay, you've got the illness, but you don't sustain the consequences of the illness in terms of its residual or persistent symptoms or disabling effects. And the third kind is that when individuals have advanced stages of the illness, you're able to mitigate those to sort of stabilize the illness at that stage. So the good news is that even though historically there were either specious theories and preposterous kinds of treatment, those all sort of evolved into pretty nihilistic notion of people who had schizophrenia were doomed from the womb, and it was inexorable in terms of their consequences. But that's not true. It is treatable. The only qualification is that your success and your therapeutic goals really depend on where in the course of the illness you first intervened.
Okay, those are three great points. Mimi, you got a question?
Well, since we're moms and a large portion of our audience is moms, thank you for mentioning the importance of family and family involvement in your book, because that's a recurring theme with us. And I'm just wondering what families can do to get more psychiatrists on board the way that you are, because our anecdotal experience between the three of us is they expend a lot more energy trying to exclude us than utilize us.
Well, this is unfortunately a complicated question that has a number of different things that are relevant to understand it. First, I have two sons. As a parent, when I was in medical school, probably the most depressing rotation I had was on the pediatric oncology service. But apart from that, I can't think of anything that's worse in terms of the despair and the distress it causes a parent than having a child who develops schizophrenia, because it is so tragic. It comes on when people are reaching the prime of their life, their whole life, their potential ahead of them. It changes them. It changes the people that you knew and who they were. into somebody that is different. And this happens in other illnesses like, Alzheimer's disease, but that's at the end of life. And it's in a way that is accepted because it blends into the antiquated notion of, sort of senile dementia, meaning as you age, you become cognitively impaired, doddering, etc.
Right. The timetable is, a little more sort of air quotes normal. And you're certainly someone I wish had been my psychiatrist for my son at the time. Is there anything that we can do to help other psychiatrists besides hand them your book to feel that way?
This is so, I don't want to get too pedantic, but medicine didn't become specialized until the beginning of the 19th century. Before that, you had curers and carvers. Carvers were surgeons, curers were physicians. They didn't really have much to do other than bleed and things like that. But specialization began at the beginning of the 19th century, and the first specialty was actually the brain doctors in 1808. And neurology and psychiatry was together, but the name that was conferred on them was psychiatry. It was called by Johann Riehl, a German psychiatrist, psychiatry, because healing of the mind. And the smartest doctors were psychiatrists that dug up bodies and explored anatomic pathology. Ultimately, neurology diverged when psychiatrists discovered Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, Korsakoff psychosis. And the highest, apart from being an academic and doing research, the highest position that a psychiatrist could aspire to is to be the superintendent of an asylum, a mental institution. However, there's nothing they really did that helped them. It was just providing what they thought was a humane environment. It didn't get people better. And then Freud came along and completely changed the game to a disease of the mind and trying to understand the components of it, the id, ego, superego, and how those conferred mental disturbances. And that gave psychiatrists a way out of these, and they used to call them alienists. Psychiatrists were called alienists because they lived alien to society. It gave them a way out. They can now have Holly Street practices or Fifth Avenue practices, and they could treat the worried well. It was cleaner, nicer, better clientele, and charged better fees. And that was terrible because they abandoned the responsibility, and the responsibility for the mid to latter part of the 20th century was assumed by non-physician mental health professionals, psychologists, social workers, etc. And there is a contingent of what are called community psychiatrists, but psychiatry hasn't re-embraced this. The majority of psychiatrists don't specialize in SMIs, serious mental illness, and they don't take insurance. And so when you say, how can we get more psychiatrists to be invested in providing what is the optimal kind of treatment?
Including the family, if possible.
Well, the family is important for so many ways. And again, I don't want to go on too long, but there are all these threads that figure into this. So psychiatrists can't treat people with schizophrenia alone. It is a team-based, multidisciplinary disease management approach. So you need to have a clinic with a scope of services, and the scope of services have to have a workforce that's trained, and there has to be a reimbursement system that's able to sustain it. But there's another thing which is even more insidious. As government, and this is particularly in the US, became more of a protector and solving the problems of the people in society, it loosened the motivation, the incentive, the obligation of families to stick by their infirmed relative. And when I was training, and since then continued, when a patient diagnosed with schizophrenia was admitted to the hospital, even the first time, the first week, a social worker would begin to apply for Medicaid. And in order to qualify for Medicaid, your financial assets have to be below a certain level. And so the family had to deplete whatever could be attributable to the patient in order for them to qualify.
That's still very true. That's still very true.
So they became wards of society. But if you look at and this is where a misleading observation is often thrown out for the wrong reasons. In underdeveloped or developing countries, they point to statistics of the outcome of people with schizophrenia is better. And the reason it's better is, one, because the complexity of society and the demands on people are less, but also because the family unit keeps people. If they don't ostracize them, they don't let them become wards of society, they support them. And apart from medication and the psychosocial services, the support of a single individual who's a constant presence and is dedicated to the person's well-being is the most precious aspect of a treatment program. And there's countless examples. I point in the book to John Nash's wife, who stood by him. If you have that by itself is worth 10 psychiatrists, who were even at the top of their game.
Right.
I had a chance to serve with Fred Fries, so I loved it in the book. That another example you gave was his wife, Penny Fries, who helped keep him on track, and he was a brilliant man. So yes, and we like to be those one people we don't like to be, but we are the one constants in our sons' lives because we insist, but it's really hard to get in, as Mimi said, to the psychiatrist. One thing I really liked about your book, and I liked many things about it, but I love the research that you have. So much research. A lot of times on this show, we like to make statements, but you back up very strong statements with research. Another thing I really love about it is the fact that, as you said in your 3 reasons for writing it, that schizophrenia is treatable. So today, people, unlike our sons, people have a chance, if they're in the first episode, to get into first episode programs. And why, could you tell us and our listeners why that works so well, and that people sometimes even recover? And what do you mean by recovery?
Well, recovery is a term that really grew out of the patient movement, where they said clinical medicine has done nothing for us, and we're going to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and do it ourselves. And it said, I can be symptomatic, I can be not able to function in the optimal way, but I can still have a meaningful life. And so it defined recovery in a very different way. But if you want to define recovery in a traditional way, meaning the reduction or the remission of symptoms and the lack of progression of the illness such that it causes disability that seems to be irreversible, that at this point can only be done by preempting it. And it's no different in that sense from the neurodegenerative diseases that occur usually later in life. So there's a window of opportunity that usually is in the first 5 or so years, from the prodrome till the initial years after a full-blown onset of psychosis and diagnosis. That is really the time to have the most impact. Now, it doesn't mean that game over. If you descend down the slippery slope of progression and deterioration, it doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done. At all stages of the illness, improvement is possible. I have some patients that I began treating in the 1980s when clozapine was being studied for reintroduction into American treatment, and they have a better life than I do. They have a social life. They go to the professional sports games. They go to concerts. They need a lot of support. They have to have a supervised residence. They have to have a clubhouse to go to. They have to have rehabilitation programs to attend. And they have periodic exacerbations of symptoms, but they do pretty darn well as outpatients with these prosthetics. Now, here's going to be this is going to be the shocker for your program. First heard here. There has been, for 2 centuries almost, a vigorous debate among scientists and psychiatrists about what happens in the brain to cause this progression of the illness, where you go from having psychotic symptoms to that are treatable or suppressible to having those that don't respond to treatment persist at some residual level, and also are joined by negative symptoms and cognitive impairment. What is causing this progression? We know this occurs with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and frontotemporal dementia, cerebrovascular dementia. It's the toxic proteins, it's the vascular deficiency. But literally thousands of studies, postmortem studies in schizophrenia, has never been able to find the footprints of what causes it. And that's led to a debate between people who believe it's all neurodevelopmental, meaning genes affecting the way the brain develops, and people that say it's a progressive illness, we just haven't discovered the basis. So due to a study that we're currently in the midst of now, we've analyzed data and come to a conclusion that the progression that occurs in schizophrenia is due to accelerated aging. So
Wow.
everyone
was right. That is a shocker.
In everyone's body, and including the brain, there's a maturational process that occurs over the life cycle. You're born, you become a toddler, you become an adolescent, you become a young adult, and in middle age, you begin to have an age-dependent decline in brain volume as you experience some atrophy of aging. But it was only 15 years ago that the sirtuin genes were cloned, meaning these are 7 genes spread across the human genome that define the lifespan of a human being. And every creature on Earth has a defined lifespan. If you're a fruit fly, your lifespan is 24 hours. If you're a tortoise, it's 150 years. Humans, 80, 90 years. So there's a process that causes this to occur. And many companies, not many, but companies now have, in a way that's scientifically very credible and rigorous, have begun to develop pharmaceuticals to slow or reverse aging. So I'm not going to go into what the data was that pointed us to this conclusion, but we believe the lack of the footprints in the brain for why people with schizophrenia progress and become disabled in an irreversible way is because they have a process of accelerated aging. So it's occurring in what occurs to people under normal circumstances, but more rapidly. And as a result of that, they decline faster. And they also become susceptible to the so-called diseases of aging, frailty, cognitive impairment, et cetera. So we're going to have a paper that comes out. We'll see how it's received, but it's really the first, I think, innovation in understanding what underlies the course of the illness. And it speaks to also the question that you raised before about our nomenclature and whether schizophrenia is the best way of thinking of it, or whether it's psychosis spectrum disorder. And the reason I say that is because among other distinctions, one of the major ones with schizophrenia, as opposed to bipolar disorder or depression with psychotic symptoms, is the progression and the decline, the intellectual deterioration is more prominent in people with schizophrenia. So, we believe that there is some underlying component to their disease that is different, even though many of the symptoms are overlapping with these other diagnoses.
Yeah. So
It's like breaking news, because that's not in your book.
No, I mean, you're exactly right. So a paperback, unfortunately, the book is going to go to paperback next February. And I want to add some information, including that.
it's very exciting that you include so much research in your book. There's many things we talk about here on the podcast to help families who are just starting out in this process. If you're a new listener, our sons are all in their late 30s or older. So we've been at this quite a long time, and it may be a little late for early intervention, but we always focus on hope. And one of the things I loved about your book is that it helped me to be better informed. And you even say that in your book, the more a family can be informed, the more they can know how to help. And you explained really thoroughly about the previous thoughts about schizophrenia, but also that a lot of it has to do with dopamine, but it isn't just dopamine, that it's GABA and glutamate. So that was, and that's a totally different process. And I would love to, but I'm not going to ask you to explain it here, but just, it was exciting to me to see that there's other research and other reasons why my son is cognitively impaired the way he is, and, is lacking some of the joie de vivre as he used to have. So, and this just shows that research continues to go on. So due to accelerated aging, you heard breaking news here first. Let me ask you though, I think you've already answered this, like whether is true recovery possible? What do you mean by recovery? And I think a bit of the answer is it depends on how quickly we catch it. Is that true?
Yeah, how quickly we catch it and how effective or how good the treatment is. So by the best you can hope for is somebody gets sick, usually in the age window of adolescence, young adulthood. They get treated promptly, their symptoms remit, and they don't have any recurrences, and they live a normal life. Okay,
And it was a blip.
It sounds like it's pie in the sky, but I've I know patients, I've treated patients that have had, I follow them on Facebook, and I'm amazed. So it is possible, and people would then say, well, if anybody recovers, they didn't have schizophrenia. It's like kind of a tautology. So it's not true. And even at more advanced stages of the illness, a lot can be done, because much of what I do when I see patients who are already 10, 15, 20 years into the illness is to undo things that shouldn't have been done in the way of treatment, or make revisions in the diagnosis. So I don't want to throw my colleagues under the bus, but nobody ever tells you they go to the second best doctor. Everybody thinks they go to the best doctor. But in psychiatry, people will complain, oh, the doctor really doesn't do anything. And the variation in quality is not what it should be. And so how do you find good treatment? You have to be, family members have to be very proactive to do this. And the sad, simple fact of the matter is the optimal forms of treatment for people at all stages of the illness is not there. You can't find it in one place. You have to cobble it together. And this one patient of mine that I was referring to previously, so in the late 1980s, this is a young from Great Neck who's was going to college, and she got sick and she didn't respond to treatment very well and ended up in state hospital, and very likely would have spent the rest of her life there, or at least a good part of it. And her mother, who was extremely aggressive, identified our program as studying clozapine, thought that might be, so she was one of the first people that was treated with clozapine. She got better. And there was no residential facilities to be, so she spent several years in inpatient state hospital. She couldn't, even if she was better symptomatically, she couldn't just, go live in an apartment and attend some outpatient clinic. So, and there was no residential facilities in New York anyway. So she found Gould Farm in Massachusetts, and she went there. And Gould Farm has this supervised component that's, in a rural area. Then they have step-down programs that are in suburban Boston. And then she's now in an independent apartment living with a roommate where somebody visits her once a week. But the mother then cobbled together and using every means of availing herself of government-sponsored resources to get a ride. There's rides that were offered. Massachusetts is more progressive than most places, but the point is that she would go to Boston University, Bill Anthony's program one day. She volunteered at a job on Mass Ioneer another day. She went to a clubhouse at Gould Farm another day. And the mother cobbled this together and did it in a way that was financially viable. But she had this dogged persistence and this relentless desire to and it worked, but not everybody can do that. and specifically if you're living in places that are more remote or rural. So the infrastructure, the workforce, the financing system does not lend itself to do it. Right now, what I have like a small component of a practice, which is, and this is important to talk about. It's also a kind of a third rail issue, is treating people or trying to treat people who are adult children, supported, dependent financially on their families, and have no insight into the fact that they're ill, won't accept treatment. And I will do various things, simply go and try and meet with them, have lunch, and build a relationship in the hopes that that'll eventually, and also monitor that their behavior doesn't get out of control so they get injured or hurt somebody. Or in other instances where the person, this is a 27-year-old girl, a high functioning immigrant, Russian family. She won't speak to me. She won't even speak to her family. So we get in a car. We get a car. So we follow her around because she's always busy. She says, I have too many things. I have an appointment here. I have an appointment there. And her family's thinking, what is she doing? She doesn't have any business. And she just wanders around going into places. And we would go into the places after she left, and we would ask the proprietor, does this person come in regularly? He says, oh yeah, she comes in. She's kind of odd. I think something's wrong with her, but she doesn't do anything bad. And so, you're relegated, and all this speaks to the issue of how can you impose treatment on someone who doesn't want it. And there's a principle called parens patriae, which means parent of the state, that was used as the reason for civil commitment previously. That if somebody was in a state they couldn't make good judgments, care for themselves, then that justified doctors and family imposing treatment over their objection. But because of the abuses of psychiatry and the snake pits of asylums before, that was changed in 1970, and now it's imminent danger. So to do something, when you say what can be done to change things in terms of getting better residences, having a better scope of services to avail oneself to, having more psychiatrists involved and adapting, a mentality of the kind that I was describing in the book. You also need to deal with, what do you do with people that won't accept treatment, but they're not breaking things up and hurting people right now, although they could at some point.
So how would you answer that? Because that's a big question.
Yeah, well, my answer, though, unfortunately gets met with a lot of boos and catcalls. I think that
I don't think you'll find that with our audience, or with any of us.
Well, there's a lot of in NAMI who feel that way. And so, the way that that's referred to among similarly minded people as myself is we're allowing people to die with their rights on.
Yes, we've used that phrase often ourselves. Given that our sons are older and all three of us are basically jealous of first episode participants, I see patients of our Mindy and my doctor, Dr. Lieberman, who, they got with Dr. Lieberman at 17, 18, 19, and they're back in college and they're living lives. And, my poor guy's 37 years old. He was, if not untreated, but poorly treated for 15 years. And there's no way to get that time back. And I'm just wondering, for people like us who all that time has elapsed, what does the help optimally look like? And what can we do? Because I just feel like we're just running, trying to play catch up. And one other thing I just wanted to say is it's a good thing that patient you just described was a Jewish American princess, because you basically need to be royalty to afford a place like Gould Farm. And we just sit back and look at these places and long for them, but they're not a reality for us.
Right. And if there's any listener who doesn't know what Jewish American princess is, it's an old term that we're not talking about a real princess. It's a term. Nobody means anything by it, but it's just something that is used to describe people who grew up with a lot of money in Long Island, New York. Like that's kind of what that is. It's meant as a joke. We have good intentions here. We're not meaning to disparage anybody or anything, and it's not a real princess. Okay.
Well,
Thank you. I'm glad you defined that, because I got lost there. I was like, what did I miss?
Is she
Miss
royalty?
something there? But what I didn't miss is the expense of Gould, because I'm co-chairing a group here in Minnesota where we're trying to look at housing that heals and how can people die in peace, people like us, when our children are still living but need a lot of help and they need us. And so I read your book and I went and looked up Gould. I thought, okay, that model, I'm going to look for that in Minnesota. And it sounded perfect, but that price tag, we quickly discarded it. So now we're looking at other things, like maybe two people could live in an apartment instead of just the one that the mental health system puts forward to everybody. And then they're so lonesome, they spiral down and that sort of thing. But can you give us any ideas about housing that wouldn't be so expensive, that a model that could be used by lots of people that would work for people with schizophrenia?
Well, there are models. The problem is they're not very numerous, and they also are expensive unless they're somehow subsidized. I mean, another place is called Cooper Reese in North Carolina. It's kind of a holistic philosophy, but they have a medical management approach as well. And these places are great, but they're so few. They also entail cost. And like I say, this is I consider this a civil rights problem. Is that, imagine if you have breast cancer and you go to the hospital and they say, well, you need a lumpectomy and you need radiation and you need chemotherapy, but we can only do a lumpectomy. And that's what exists with severe mental illness and schizophrenia. How you can manage to deal with it, it requires a lot of work and ingenuity to put it together. I think it begins, though, with a consultation, a second opinion, if you will, with somebody who is more progressive and enlightened in their thinking. And I'm going to, I guess, include myself in that group. And okay, here you are at whatever stage of your illness, and here are your, symptoms and limitations. Okay. What can be done to change that? So the first thing is you look at their treatment regimen. Then you look at whatever ancillary services they're receiving in the way of social skills training, vocational rehabilitation, socialization in a clubhouse. Case management. Is substance abuse part of the problem? What is their residential setting? Do they have any social network in terms of people or family? So you have to do like a 360 evaluation, and then you have to figure, how do we create an approach? And again, this is disease management that addresses the needs in a way that can help. And they'll never be back to how they were before they became ill, but they can be a heck of a lot better and a heck of a lot happier if it's done. But it requires, finding individuals that are oriented towards this, can do it in an affordable way, and then taking it to the next step, which is identifying the services. Now, you mentioned one other thing that's a niggling problem. Parents who have infirmed children, and oh, by the way, the thing that's embedded in this whole discussion is when it comes to minority communities, forget it. I mean, that they're in a whole different situation of neglect and inferior treatment, and that's just sort of accepted as the way of the world, which is just shameful.
But we stand against that. Just we have tried to have some episodes dealing with the disparity there, and it's not just in psychiatry, but it's across the medical field.
And I
breastfeeding, childbirth, cancer, there's many disparities. And I think that's an issue for another time, but it's absolutely true. And you do address that in your book. Mimi, what?
I just want to say something hopeful. I was at the USC fellows graduation for psychiatry this weekend because my nephew is has just become a pediatric psychiatrist. I think he looked around our family and decided we better have an in-house psychiatrist, so he became one. But the thing that I was very heartened to hear and to see is, first of all, in a city like LA, the demographic of all the students was very varied, but it was a small graduation and these people were able to talk and they were also able to give very personal introductions. And these younger doctors coming up are keyed into this stuff. And the doctors from different demographics in terms of race and all of that are really focusing their energies in changing that. I found that very hopeful.
I don't want to be the wet blanket, but they have to sustain that. Your kids or young people are very idealistic, and then they get married, they have babies, they got expenses, and reality sets in. I mean, the millennials or the Gen Z or whatever it is, they may be different. I hope so. But the thing I was trying to get at is, so people set up special needs trusts to cover the cost of caring for their loved ones once they're gone. The problem is, although lawyers can set up a special needs trust to deal with the financial issues, it doesn't ensure that they're going to get good treatment. There is not care planning that's associated with it. And in some cases, there's actually finagling that goes on in a way that whoever is named the executor. So one of the things that, some years ago, we tried to do at the instigation of family members and then a law firm that had a lot of big estates and trust practice was consider creating a company or an entity that provided not just the legal and financial services, but also involved care planning. So what does an individual need depending on their geography, their illness, their level of severity, et cetera, and to propose what the necessary treatment program, and then potentially to monitor as time went on that they were actually receiving it. So that got hung up. Why did it get hung up? Turns out that the law says in order to have a special needs trust or something like that, you have to be a trust company or a bank. So a law firm that wanted to do it would have to become a trust company, or if mental health providers wanted to engage with the law firm to do it. And for whatever reasons, that seemed to have been a stumbling block. So the point that I try and make, and I hope this comes out in the book, is that there's things in the world that are complex and potentially unsolvable given our current level of knowledge. Maybe it's global warming, maybe it's distribution of wealth, maybe it's terrorism. This is not an unsolvable problem. We know what could work. We just don't do it. And some things, if you have ALS, only a scientific breakthrough is going to change your prognosis. If you have schizophrenia, I would say the vast majority of people who have the illness could be doing better than they are simply because of the limitation of the treatment they've received.
Absolutely.
I think that's
true.
a powerful message in your book. And I really like that you included so much about the disparities amongst people of color and people like ourselves. And that was a powerful part of the book. I'm sure Randy's going to tell us pretty soon. We're almost out of time. So I'm going to combine two questions that I have, and maybe you can be shorter on it so we can get to, I know Mimi and Randy have more questions too. So we had one guest on earlier to talk about the relationship between marijuana and schizophrenia, psychosis, and Randy pinned him down so that he had to confess the research said marijuana caused psychosis, but he didn't know about research that would show that it would also cause schizophrenia. So you went further than that in your book. So could you address that? And then also maybe at the same time, you could address the relationship between drug use, treated versus untreated, psychosis, and dangerousness. We hear a lot of people that like to think they know what's causing dangerousness. Is it people with mental illness? Is it something else? So what is the relationship between cannabis and schizophrenia? And what is the relationship between drug use, not taking your meds, and dangerousness?
Well, those are controversial, but actually very easy questions to answer. The evidence is indisputable that cannabis, so if you have a constitutional or genetic vulnerability for schizophrenia, cannabis will increase that likelihood of developing it. It is a precipitating recreational intoxicant, and it's even more so now. So when I was in college, not that I ever inhaled, we would smoke naturally grown cannabis, and the cannabis has 100 plus constituents, elements in it, but the only one that's psychoactive is THC. And the concentration of THC in most naturally, even the most potent forms, Vietnamese or Maui Wowie, was 2 to 10%. Now, if you go to dispensaries in California or in New York or Colorado, the THC concentration is upwards of 80%.
Wow.
And so the population frequency of schizophrenia is increasing, and it's going to increase. In terms
And
of,
this is something you changed your mind about, as I now have as well, right? You didn't used to think, yeah.
Even more than that, it used to be thought that if the drug caused a toxic psychosis, that it went away when the recreational intoxicant was cleared from the body. But it's now known, and I mentioned in the book, that certain drugs used chronically or in large doses can produce enduring psychotic symptoms that for all purposes resemble schizophrenia. And specifically, the drugs are methamphetamine and phencyclidine, PCP. So those can induce it in people that have no vulnerability. Cannabis provokes it in people who do. Now, the other question that you had was about treatment and dangerousness. So that also, the evidence is very clear. So advocates of mental illness are often, indignant about protesting that people with mental illness are violent. And they're true. That's true in a sense. Of all violent crime in the United States, 4% is perpetrated by people with mental illness. Most of it is crime, gangs, greed, crimes of passion. But if you look at violent crime, as it's defined by the FBI, between 25 and 40% are perpetrated by individuals with mental illness, mostly young males, mostly psychotic disorders, and almost always untreated. And these people are not doing it because they have a grudge against society. They're not doing it because they're ideologic zealots. They're doing it because they're impelled by their symptoms. And I've consulted on a number of cases. Jared Loeffner, James Holmes, the Korean student at Virginia Tech, Wendell Williamson in North Carolina. These people, after they're treated, look back and they say, I didn't know what I was doing. Ellen Sachs, who's at USC, has a wonderful description of psychosis. She says it's not an on and off switch, it's a rheostat. And when it's at its worst, you know no reality except the delusions, the hallucinations in your brain, in your mind. When it's at a lower level, it's like a background radio that you hear and maybe a distraction, but it's not driving your behavior. And if you interview these people after they're treated, they tell you the exact same thing. I just thought this was happening. No way I could distinguish it. And, now I see, it was all part of an illness.
Wow. So there is, and Mindy was right. We are running out of time. We have more questions, although a lot of them you kind of answered as you expanded on your answers to the other ones. And I do want to ask you one more, which is just about you. Like, why schizophrenia? Was that the thing you chose to specialize in as a psychiatrist? I mean, we're so glad you did, but tell us why did you become so interested in schizophrenia specifically?
Well, at some point in early in my training, I wanted to pursue academic psychiatry, research, because my intellectual curiosity, or one of my advisors said, do you want to be, depends on which side of the podium you want to be on. You want to be in the audience or you want to be on the lectern. I was just intrigued by trying to answer questions. But I was actually initially drawn to depression. But then two things happened. One was I had a patient, when this is a very common story, who was a college student in Ivy League school from a pretty affluent family, and he had his first psychotic episode. He's then hospitalized. He gets better pretty quickly, and he goes back to. He doesn't want to wait and take a semester off. He goes back right away, and he finds the medications are dulling his thinking, and he doesn't like them, and so he stops taking it. And he relapses again, and this is a story in the book of Jonah. And before you know it, his life is irreparably changed. And I'm thinking, whoa, this is pretty bad. And there was this glib attitude of psychiatry at that time. This is circa early 1980s, late 70s, that this glib attitude of letting people learn the hard way by relapsing and learning not to not comply. It's like letting somebody who has, cerebral vascular disease not take their, anticoagulant or blood pressure. And then the other thing was, and this is in the book, I came home one night and I was going to read myself to sleep like I usually did. And I picked up the New Yorker and read. I stayed up like till 4 a.m. reading a 4-part series by Susan Sheehan called There's No Place on Earth for Me. Is There No Place on Earth for Me? The story by Sylvia Frumkin, a fictitious name. And it was the most, it just like, I had such an impact on me. I'm saying, how could somebody have to suffer like this? I mean, it was grotesquely funny with the things she did, but it was misery. And all of it is avoidable, or much of it is avoidable. And then, this wasn't the reason I pursued it, but in the book, I described in the course of writing it, these things about my own family I hadn't realized. That my great aunt had been in the hospital I visited on a field trip when I was in high school, and nobody ever talked about her. And then, so, people think schizophrenia is something that happens to people over there and it's remote and mysterious, and that's just not true. So at any rate, if you wanted to take on the biggest challenge, because schizophrenia is kind of the poster child of mental illness, that was it.
Wow. Well, Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman, thank you so much. Maybe you'll come back again and answer the other 100 questions we had for you. Well, we've gone to an hour, and the book is Malady of the Mind, Schizophrenia, and the Path to Prevention, and it's more than just prevention. It's the path to treatment. It's about peeling the onion. It's about how do you get to the diagnosis, the importance of the family, stories, careful, meticulous, and supported research, your own experience, and you have such respect and love for your patients that it shows through in the book. So we highly recommend it, and we thank you so much for coming on to Schizophrenia, 3 Moms in the Trenches. It's been an honor and a delight.
And I want to thank you for your outspokenness in your book. I think you'd fit right in here if you were one of us moms, because we speak our minds. And in your book, despite the professional that you are and your professional demeanor and your talking, you've got some pretty strong statements in that book. And I love every one of them. And they're backed up by research. So everyone should definitely read your book. Thank you.
Well,
Mimi, last words, and then Jeff, I'll let you have the
Thank
final
you so much
word.
for being here. We really appreciate it, and this has been fascinating.
Thank you. Well, I'm happy to come back whenever you wanted. But what I would say is that one thing that's just been enormously beneficial to the psychiatric community, and particularly to the research community, is the patient advocacy movement. The fact that people like yourselves have taken upon themselves to, sort of speak out and to try and spread awareness, and also point to just unacceptable deficiencies that exist, and to make people aware of something that they just don't get sufficient information about. So keep up the good work, and I would say it's a partnership. The mental health professionals have to work with you in trying to move things forward.
Hey, thanks for joining us for this episode of Schizophrenia, 3 Moms in the Trenches, with Randy Kay, Mindy Greiling, and Miriam Feldman. To get in touch with us or to learn more about our books, please visit our websites at miriam-feldman.com, mindygreiling.com, or randykay.com.